This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner. This is episode 222. It's got some sort of numerical significance because we've hit this number. Joining me on the podcast today is Todd DiMatteo of Goodword Brewing and Public House down in Duluth, Georgia. Welcome to the podcast, Todd.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm super excited to be here. I hardly slept last night.
Oh, man. I am riding a high. I solved Wordle in 2 this morning. And so,
Nice.
I'm just feeling good about things. I'm feeling good about life. You started sending us some beer. Our judges have really enjoyed or had a great experience with it. Last issue that we did, you guys just absolutely crushed it with, scores of 90, 92, 95, all on English style small beers, 4% and below. You've got a crazy story. You didn't intend to be in this brewing life, making the beer at Goodword. Things happened and now you're doing it. Clearly you've applied yourself with a kind of rigor and an intention that is producing some fantastic results, making some beers that even our critics have loved tasting. I know, our Best in Beer issue last year, Goodword showed up on critics lists, both from Kate Bernard and from Alex Kidd. Different beers. Kate had a Pilsner on hers. It was a dark Czech lager that Alex name checked. I'm sure if folks follow Don't Drink Beer, he wrote a very extensive review of that on his own social media and blog channels. Doing some cool stuff, getting out there. Can't wait to talk to you about how you brew, especially how you brew these small beers across all sorts of different styles. You do a festival, also little beers, focusing on those things, kind of celebrating these small beers. We're going to talk about brewing those small beers, but before we do, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D Chiller's new micro-channel condensers. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks along with lower global warming potential. G&D Chillers engineers are committed to green technology design while developing a more energy-efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Also, support for this episode comes from BSG and Fermentis, the obvious choice for beverage fermentation. Safru LD20 is a new all-in-one Saccharomyces pastorianus yeast and enzyme blend designed to produce lower-carb, dry lager beers. Safru LD20 is capable of high attenuation at low temperatures, making it the perfect choice for clean lagers with very low residual sugars. To harness the power of Safru LD20, or to learn more about Fermentis' range of fermentation solutions, get in touch with BSG at go.bsgcraft.com/contact-us. Todd, talk to me about this brewing history for you. You were a home brewer. You worked for a prominent beer bar. Have this long-standing love of craft beer, but you never intended to be a brewer, and here you are. Let's talk a little bit about that strange path that you took to get to this position.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a strange path. I started at Brickstore Pub in 2005. And before that, I was living in Asheville, North Carolina, which the scene was like nowhere near where it is now. I mean, I remember having a Highland. I used to drive a motorcycle, and I'd have a backpack. I'd go get like a bomber of Highland and throw it in the back and head home after work. And so when I moved back to Atlanta and started at Brickstore, I thought that it ended with like a craft beer with Guinness and 420 and Highland, which those are all fantastic beers, but my mind was definitely blown. And I fell in love with Belgian beers and, quickly moved towards IPAs and, did the whole super bitter. We actually just re-released a modern West Coast IPA today here at Goodword. But yeah, I didn't start homebrewing right away. It was, I want to say it was like 2012, 2013, somewhere in there. I knew I wanted to do something else. I loved being part of Brickstore, and it's amazing. And but I wanted to have my own thing and put a stamp on it. And, I was a musician at the time too. So I always have, had a need for like a creative outlet. And, once I started homebrewing, I remember the first time I homebrewed, I convinced these guys who had been homebrewing for a while to come over and help me. So I had all these bottles and, I was like, all right, we're going to crack open all these bottles. It's going to be fucking fun. It's going to be a blast or whatever. And we got so drunk. I learned like nothing. All I learned was like not to be afraid to fuck up some beer. And so that was my first foray into homebrewing. And then I just kind of caught the bug. And so
you got to follow the rules now. Don't drink until you've,
never,
until you've knocked
hard,
out.
Fast rule.
Yeah.
Yeah. I never do now. Unless I'm, doing a collab and I'm on their turf, I'll crack one open. But anyway, I was working full time there and I was brewing, when I'd get off of a, day shift until like 1 or 2 in the morning. So I would do 3 or 4 brews a week. And so quickly turned into like, instead of doing what may be just another iteration of a craft beer bar, my business partner, Ryan Skinner, and I decided that we wanted to open our own brew pub. And so, the Brickstore guys are our business partners. And, so they've helped facilitate this thing. We actually ended up, like you said earlier, in Duluth, Georgia. Meanwhile, me and my family lived less than a mile from Brickstore for years and years, and convincing myself and my wife to leave the perimeter and come out to the burbs was definitely a long process. But, after finding the right, area, and I do feel like Duluth was the right area because the city has been, pivotal in our success in the community as well, was absolutely the right choice. So if you fly into Atlanta, there's amazing breweries, in town. So if you want to come to Good Word, you're definitely driving at least 45 minutes away, which is, it's kind of a bummer. But also I feel like, when you get here, you see why you came, because what we're doing is unique and special and all that sort of stuff.
So you started the brewery, and your intention was not to brew the beer.
Not at all. Yeah, we actually hired this young guy from Canada who was great. We hired him a few months before we opened. And my role at that point, I wanted to, help produce recipes and do, going to retailers and doing visitations and that kind of stuff. And I was going to back up Ryan, my business partner mentioned earlier, with front of the house stuff. So I was going to play kind of a middle role just to kind of keep myself excited about, all of it. So anyway, about 2.5 months into us being open, our brewer is from Canada. His visa was running out. That's what he was telling us. And so it was getting close to the 6-month mark. But anyway, he was like, I need to go home and figure out this visa. I'm worried about losing my health insurance through Canada or whatever. And I'm like, okay, it sounds kind of odd. I was like, we have this brew coming up for Allagash Day. Why don't you do this? Sit in with me on the brew and kind of, make sure I don't fuck anything up. And then, then I'll be fine, be okay. At least I'll have some sort of know-how, because we don't know when he's going to come back if he leaves. So he's like, sure, I'll do that. And he was supposed to leave on Tuesday, and he chose an earlier flight. And so I'm like, holy shit. And we had not a falling out, but I was pretty pissed. I'm like, dude, you kind of put me in a bad position. So for the brew day, I'm watching. First off, I pushed it as far back as I could, so I knew I couldn't make the date for Allagash Day. And so I was watching YouTube videos. I'm calling Yoran and Tim, some other brewers I know here in Georgia, trying to get
Halfway Crooks.
Yeah. And so this is before he was still at I think he was still at 3 Taverns at the time.
Right.
But yeah, he's from Halfway Crooks. But anyway, so finally I said, fuck it. And milled the beer in, started at 7 a.m. And I'd never cleaned a tank, never CIP'd a tank, never, our brew house is a 10-barrel 3-vessel system. And it's, has a little small, decent automation package. But, you look at it and it's there's a lot going on if you don't know what the fuck you're doing. And so I started around 7 or so and finished around 2 that night. And I was like, well, I guess worst case scenario is I'll dump this beer. Anyway, it did turn out, and the beer, I called it Man in Motion, which is a 3.5% table beer. Definitely the lowest on Untapped as far as the ratings go. But it was kind of like that first day, I had those guys coming homebrew. I'm like, all right, well, it wasn't that bad. I might not have did it well because we were drinking on that day. So the long brew day, I know I can at least produce beer. And so I'd put an ad on Pro Brewer looking for another brewer. Had a lot of the same folks who reached out when we first hired our brewer. reply again. And so I'm like, all right, well, if these same folks are reaching back out, I might just hold off. And so basically what I did is just slowed everything down as much as I could and learned as much as I could with reading, watching videos and all of that. But telling my business partners that like, hey, I'm going to be the brewer and I'm going to help run front of the house was like crazy because they never saw me in a capacity, nor did I see myself in that capacity. While secretly wanting to, for sure. I was like, yeah, I would love to be the one making the beer. I feel like being the person who creates the beer, it makes the story, it's a better story. You know what I mean? Like, being a part of brewery is great and all the jobs are very important, but like being the one who like produces the liquid was very important to me. I guess that comes from being a musician and a songwriter. So it's like, I wrote the song, I'm singing the song, whether my voice is that good or not. But anyway, after, 3 months of like, brew days taking a long time and like trying not to hurt myself, I kind of got the hang of it. And after about 6 months, like, all right, I'm going to have fun with this. And I literally just was like, I'm going to be as committed as I possibly can and read as much as I can about this. And I did. I read a ton of stuff and, it's definitely made me a better brewer, but of course I've made mistakes and, we've let beer go down the drain, but, not much.
It's fascinating to see that. I mean, it's such an atypical way of getting into this, but also speaks to the way that every small business develops, that the way you think things are going to go as you plan it isn't necessarily the way things are going to go. And being able to adapt and find the right roles that people need to be in is incredibly important on that. The thing that that really takes me back though is you could expect to make okay beer, beer that's passable,
Sure.
but you don't make beer that's just passable. You make really great beer and beer that everyone who is tasting it responds to. In this, it's finding a way in, to people's hearts. How'd you go from figuring out how to brew beer to getting better at brewing beer to figuring out how to make great beer?
That's a great question. I mean, so in my mind, I've always modeled what we would offer draft wise after Brick Store because, it's the quintessential, and yes, it's a beer bar, but I really don't like that. It's a pub. It's a pub with like world-class beer. And so it literally has something for, your super craft beer enthusiasts who's just gotten into it and they like hazy beer and, that sort of stuff. And then it has stuff for, the guy who's a veteran beer drinker and just knows quality and they're going to drink, fine Belgian beer or world-class lager or whatever it is. And so then you got the uncle and you got the aunts and everybody in between who like just make up this great demographic and they try to hit all of those things. And I was like, Good Word is going to hit all of those things. We're going to have something for everyone. And so as far as making really good beer, how the beer went from okay to how it is now is process and patience and a lot of reading. And, never like satisfied with where we are. I'm like, how can we make this better? And I've never made any beer where I'm like, how can I do this simpler? It's literally the opposite of that. And it's not like, how do I make this just a story for an Instagram post or something like that? Like, that's not the intention. It's like, what's going to make the absolute best beer? And I remember I listened to one of your podcasts with Kevin. I think it was on CBNB. I'm pretty sure it was. But he had said something about like, it's not one thing that makes a brewer great. It's like doing this thing and doing that thing and doing that thing. And so like for us, it became like, what really is differentiating brewery A from all the rest of these breweries? And like, all right, I'm going to figure out why that matters and try to adapt our beer. And we're going to continue to grow. And we've step mashed beer since the beginning. And we've naturally carbonated beer. We naturally carbonate beer pretty much like 65 to 70% of the way. And then we finish off with CO2. But then we started doing decoctions. And that came from a podcast we were on with John Hall and Chris from Green Bench. And he was like, well, you should try this. And I was like, in my mind, I'm like, I thought about doing it like that, but I was just a little nervous. Like everything, the first time you do it is like kind of nerve wracking. And you do it like, you know what? It's not that fucking bad. it does make for a longer day. But for me, having that person go like, man, this is really fucking great is like, I know, it's very satisfying. It's like writing a song and somebody like, man, this is really a nice song.
As I look back at that history, I'm wondering just how much of that experience tasting and serving beer through Brick Store and, building up that kind of long flavor knowledge has impacted even your expectations for your own beer. I mean, it's certainly something that I see in brewers that we would consider great, that everyone has an amazing palate, also has a knowledge of beer and, that kind of scope of flavor. The people that I think make some of the most interesting beer can also kind of encyclopedically, run through where everyone else's beers are in that similar kind of category and use that kind of knowledge of flavor and the way that different beers express and the choices that other brewers have made to kind of feed into their own choices. Do you see that in your own work? How much is that kind of, background and experience drinking lots of great beer and serving lots of great beer kind of impacted your approach to brewing?
It's huge. I mean, it's a very big part of all that, without a doubt. Another big piece of that too, and I'll give credit to my business partner, Ryan Skinner. He was the beer manager at Brick Store before he left and to join Good Word as an owner. But he's a certified Cicerone and a BJCP judge. So like we're hypercritical of our beer, and we're not just like, God damn, that's good. Like that's not something, he's very pragmatic, and I'm really hard on myself when we drink something. So if he tries something, he's like, that's fucking good. Then I'm like, this is probably gonna be amazing. You know what I mean? Like, cause he's as harsh as I am on our beer. But yeah, I think that's helped me get better. I mean, like, being critical and not just back patting. We don't do a whole lot of that, so yeah, it's really just all about the work. But yeah, being around world-class beer from the age of like 25 or 26, in 2005 to now, yeah, it makes it really hard and daunting to do like, all right, we're going to make a Belgian quad. And so we made a Belgian quad, it was like, well, this is good. And I didn't brew it again for like 2 years. And then the last time I brewed it, I will say that the carbonation level is like a little low on it, to be honest with you. Flavor-wise, it's really good. But we set it out with all of these, Rochefort and St. Bernardus, Chimay, Reserve. And we had like 7 or 8 beers we grabbed from Brick Store, and we blinded ourselves on our beer. And it was just too easy to pick our beer out because, it's not bottle conditioned. And I'm like, fuck, we got to fucking bottle condition this beer. Like, this isn't ever going to be as good as we want it to be. It's never going to stand up to these other beers. So we won't brew that beer again until we can bottle condition it. And if somebody is listening to this and they have a bottle of that at the house, it's good. It's just not great.
That's the creative curse, right? That it's hard to be happy with what you do if you're and I do the same thing. I see every flaw, every small flaw, every typo that somehow makes it through all of our editing process. But that's how you make, how you can, keep trying to push to be better, to improve what you do, and not make those same kinds of, small mistakes that throw things off, or even just, not realize that full kind of creative potential. I think it's a challenge that all of us go through, whether we're talking about brewing or any other creative work we do. I want to talk about brewing small beers in particular, because that is something that you have focused on, again, and built a whole festival around it, but really done well in that Good Word context. Before we do that, supply chain challenges are here to stay for a while. So why not trust the experts to handle freight for your ingredients? Old Orchard is partnered with a leading logistics firm in the craft beverage industry to transport your craft concentrate blends. When you order 2 pails or more of concentrate from Old Orchard, you qualify for freight quotes from various carriers and can stay up to date on the status of your shipment. To get started on a freight quote for craft concentrates today, head over to oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, Brew Monitor from Precision Fermentation is the first real-time comprehensive fermentation monitoring solution. It works with your existing fermentation tanks to track dissolved oxygen, pH, gravity, pressure, temperature, and conductivity in real time from any smartphone, tablet, or PC. Brew Monitor provides detailed insight into your fermentations that helps improve beer consistency, reduce tank time, and increase overall efficiency, saving your brewery time and money. Get started for 30 days risk-free. Visit precisionfermentation.com/brewing. So yeah, Todd, let's talk about small beers. What are some of these cores? And what I find interesting is you brew little beers. And when I say I'm talking 4.5% and lower, and you brew them across a whole bunch of different styles. You brew Czech-style lagers, you brew German-style lagers, you brew English-style ales. You know, you are really play in this small beer space, which as a brew pub that also serves food and wants to be that gathering place for people makes a lot of sense. But from your perspective, talk to me about how you kind of creatively envision this kind of small beer program, and how you choose beers and styles, to go through and brew.
Yeah, for sure. Being a brew pub definitely has a big, it's a big reason we do that. But it's also like my age. I think I told you before the show, I just turned 42 in December. And I definitely will crack open a big beer every now and then and sip it. But it's like what I really want out of a beer now, and I think that more and more people are wanting out of beers is balance. And so before I ever, decide what the ingredients are going to be, it's like, what kind of beer is this? How can I balance it, whether it's hops or the malt character or any of that kind of stuff? We actually made a petite IPA too, which is a bullshit term, of course, our style. But it was a 3.6%, like a little hazy IPA, and it was very well attenuated, and it was fucking delicious. And, we didn't go crazy with the dry hopping. I think it was like 2 to 2.5 pounds per barrel, something like that. This collab we did with Birds Fly South. But, as a low-cal beer, we didn't even call it a low-cal beer. We just said, I think on the description for the menu, I did call it low-cal, but not like on the can labeling, that kind of stuff. But I wanted to make this a whole series now. It's like, listen, flavor doesn't have to happen at fucking 7%. And haze isn't a fucking flavor. Like, flavor is a flavor, like malt and a balance of hops. Like, I don't want to just taste this fucking wash of softness and sweetness and hops. Those beers are fine, of course, and we make those as well. But yeah, as far as, I'm just like looking up here, we have this marquee with all our most of our beers. And we have three beers that are above 6% right now. And I really just think it's all about what I want as a consumer. Like, it just happens to be I'm the brewer, but I'm brewing beer that I want to drink. And, there's, like I said, there's a handful of beers up there. We have a beer that's based off of a popular ice cream, and it's 11%. And it's fine. There's people out there who love those kind of beers, and nothing wrong with that. But for them, 70% of what we make, maybe more, is stuff that I would sit down and I would drink, day in and day out. And that's what I want, is like repeatability of a drinker. I don't want to just be this, like, I'm constantly lighting a match, like just seeing how quickly it burns. I want to have, I hate to use the term core beers because it seems like craft beer is dead in that way. But I want to have beers that we're constantly perfecting, and they're getting better, and and I want to come back to them and keep drinking them.
Let's talk about it creatively, because again, you play with a variety of, of styles. And yes, petite IPA might be a bullshit term, but aren't they all at some, like, everything's a bullshit term until other people start making it, and then it becomes something real. And the only difference is enough other people adopt it and start doing it, and then the things that are bullshit become real. That's the way that every beer style is. All of these were once a figment of a beer marketer's imagination until they became a thing. Nonetheless, in terms of, seeking inspiration from other brewing traditions, talk to me about how you, say, for example, pull inspiration for small English beers, like mild, bitter, English porter and whatnot.
Yeah.
Where do you go into, to pull first the brewing ideas, and then, talk to me about that process of iteration, and developing and improving on those things.
When we first opened, I was like, I want to make, an English style bitter, and I want to make a mild, and we ended up making a porter around the same, a little while later. But anyway, these were all like named after Ninja Turtles. But it came from like, well, what does that look like? I have a recollection from my time at Brick Stores, what Fuller's is like, one of the greatest. And, I had a handful of milds. But anyway, it may have been like a year and a half ago now, maybe a little longer. I was like, I'm not brewing those beers anymore until I research and learn more about these styles. And the staff was like, you're not going to brew Rocksteady and Bebop anymore? What the fuck? They were like, Matt, it sounds funny. That's how popular these beers were amongst our regulars and our staff. And so I remember sitting down and like, I'm going to finish these books before we re-approach these beers. And so I started brewing Analog Life and Digital Comforts and Quantum Immortality after reading these books and just doing deep dives into research. I mean,
what books were you reading?
Like Mild Ale was one of the books that that basically I was like, I'm not, until I finish this, we're not brewing any more of this stuff. And then I was also, I found some videos. I think it was Mitch Steele or someone was talking about Chevalier, the crisp grain, which was like at one point for 60 years the most popular two-row. And then Crisp took it back from like, seed and recultivated this. And I'm like, that sounds super interesting. So anything that I can find that makes a story and I can latch onto the story to, get the creative juices going, as it will. I'm looking for. And still, same thing with like, all these Czech styles. Like we started doing Czech style beers as a collab with Blue Jacket. And like you said, that beer got some love from Alex Kidd, which is great. But I'm like, do we know enough about Czech style beers? We just brewed a Czech 10 Play-Doh. So I'm constantly like trying to push myself to learn more. And I'm like, what I really need to do is get on a fucking plane and go to Czechia, and fucking see it firsthand. So yeah, it's just all about seeking out any information or even talking to brewers who I like look up to,
Sure.
Lisa Allen and, we did a beer with her.
That's right. Coastline Pills, right?
Coastline Pills. Yeah. But like seeing what her process is through a collaboration and then, creating and actually before we even brewed the beer, we'd sent her beer a couple of times. I was brewing a smoke beer for the first time and I'm like, all right, who are the like 3 or 4 smartest brewers I know or kind of know? And I'd only met her via email and I'm like, what would the percentage be of smoked malt if you're going for this? And she gave me 2 different ranges of what they do for some of their beers. And I'm trying to think of who else I reached out to, but like, it was Mike Karnowski from Zebulon.
Sure.
And he makes fantastic beers as well. And I'm like, all right, so based on what these people are telling me, this is what I'm going to try for the first time. Because again, dipping your toe in the water for the first time, I've always been a little scared. It's like, oh God, how cold is the water? But then you realize, hey man, the water's warm, it's fine. And so since then we've done 3 smoked beers and I want to do more. The thing is with smoked beers, they a little bit slower of a mover for us. But I also found that like the smoked malt isn't quite linear. You don't just go, we did a little less than 10% on a Helles. We did a collab with Schilling. And it was like the faintest kiss of smoke. We wanted it to be subtle, but it was like almost a little too subtle. So 27% or a little over 27% in a smoked Marzen was like, holy shit. It was like in your face. And then we did 100% Beechwood smoked wheat in a Pewa Grzycki, and it was very subtle. So it's funny how smoke interplays, but like, having a collection of people that you like look up to and respect has been honestly a huge part of my, I guess, quick, in 4 or 5 years as a professional brewer, climb. And, I'm never too proud to be like, hey, how the fuck do you do this? Or what's your process with this? I mean, I was talking with, I think it was Humble Sea or Threes. We were talking about biofine because like we're so small, we don't have you know, I don't have horizontal tanks and I don't have a centrifuge or anything like this. I'm like, do you guys use this? And they're like, no, we don't. It fucks with head retention. And I'm like, I bet these guys are fucking right. So, you know, there's a lot of that. Just listening to your peers that you respect, you know, has helped me grow.
Sure. Back on that subject of small English beers, what would you say were the biggest changes that happened as you dove into research from the prior iterations to the beers that you started making? You know, you mentioned Chevalier, barley is one of those things to build a connection to. But what were some of the other, recipe elements, technique, process changes that you made along the way that you found improved those beers, that got them closer to what you had in your mind or what you envisioned?
Well, I mean, as I was reading, I realized that what we had previously brewed as like an ESB was fine, but it felt like a little clumsy as far as the recipe goes. So I basically just cleaned it up. It's only 3 malts compared to what it was for our digital comfort set is. But also I got more tuned into like, how do those, pale English beers like break down? And so at first I was like, well, cool, I'm going to fall into this range of like an ordinary bitter. And what's funny is I brewed it and it was like, instead of being 3.8, it was like 3.9%. I'm like, well, that's the best bitter now. And so every time I brewed it, it's always in 3.9. So we just said, fuck, it's the best bitter. But that like leads me to think about something that I think Jeff Allworth and Stan Hieronymus were saying about calling it like this pub ale term. And it's kind of a worry that I have, not to kind of divert the conversation, but kind of a worry I have with like people who aren't doing research or don't know styles, haven't been to England or whatever, are brewing things, and they could confuse the public about what this is and just calling it a pub ale or whatever the moniker could be. It's like, it needs to be as close a representation. I guess it's my opinion. It should be as close a representation of what the style is, so people know what they're looking for when they go. Like, what is an ESB? What is a best bitter? What is a dark mild? What is this? Because all I have is Brewery X who, put it out and they dry hopped it with some New Zealand hops or some shit. It's like, don't want that to happen to these classic styles. And, it's funny because, we joked about like fruited lagers maybe a year ago. And it's like, God, please God. But I think that's probably happening. But anyway,
it is happening. We've received them. I haven't tasted one that's been great yet, but people have been sending them to us. There's, I would say that, from my perspective, there's no axiomatic reason not to do something, but if you can't make a good beer that way, then why do it that way? But I get you, where you're coming from on this. If you're going to call it something, keep it within that expectation, especially when that expectation is built by a tradition that's not necessarily yours. Having said that, the kind of creativity of craft brewers knows no bounds, and it is also interesting to see how people, push things. And there are certainly spheres in which are more interesting to push those things. It's kind of, you get into the American beer styles like hazy IPA now, although, and all bets are off. You can just make it whatever the hell you want. That also fits something we've been trying to talk about, which is moving the conversation around fruited sour beer from the Gose Berliner nomenclature into just embracing this idea of American fruited sour beer, so that those beers can just become what they are and what they should be, rather than tied to a term like Berliner, which, there was never a Berliner that looked like a fruit smoothie puree and served that way. It's just, those things can exist and these things can be separate things, and it's good. And we don't need to call something just because, it makes it sound more romantic or has some connection to something that isn't correct. So I get where you're coming from there, while at the same time trying to foster this idea of creativity. We're going to get back to talking about brewing, but before we do that, from the rotatable pickup tubes on Rogue Brewing's Pilot Brewhouse to the integrated hopbacks on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brewhouses, SS Brewtech has taken technology they invented, working with world-renowned industry veterans, and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head over to ssbrewtech.com. Also, have you heard of PBW tablets? Yeah, Yep, that's right. The PBW powder you've known and trusted is now in tablet form from 5-Star Chemicals, available in 2 sizes, so you can use just 1 tablet and either 32 ounces or 1 gallon of water to optimize your cleaning. Forget measuring. Just add a tablet to water and quickly clean all stainless equipment, growlers, kettles, or carboys. Purchase on their website or your favorite homebrew supplier. So let's talk then a little bit about, Czech and German style lagers. You mentioned talking to another American brewers and also trying to be respectful of where those traditions come from. And if you're going to make something, doing it that right way. What do those right ways entail for you?
I mean, if there's a style that I've never had before, will try to source one that's from where it should be from instead of finding a craft brewer first, to be honest with you. And then I'm going to dive deep into the research. But yeah, it doesn't come from like, all right, what's my way of doing this without having any knowledge of the style? So I want to do as much research about that style before I go into it. It's kind of like, well, before you play the lead, how do you play rhythm? You know what I mean? And so that's kind of how I look at all this. And the Czech dark lager that got a lot of love, I mean, that was a lot of Roe. Roe had from Blue Jacket. Had a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I look at him as like, one of the smartest brewers I know. And so we sat down like, hey, what do we want to make? Czech dark lager. We took it from there.
As an aside, for those that are all access subscribers to Craft Beer and Brewing, we've got a class with Roe available through our video learning platform. Shameless plug. But yes, right. Fantastic brewer, knows his stuff.
Yeah. We made a Schwartz beer back in 2019, and that was something that I'd never had a Schwartz beer before, I'll be honest with you. And we put it in crowlers before we had a candy line, and I mailed it to Pace Magazine, and, it ended up getting #1 in the country for a blind taste panel. What's cool about that, though, is I befriended Stan Hieronymus. I met him at Shelton Brothers Fest. We were pouring, and he'd already been here once or twice. And when I'm trying him on that beer, he's like, you may have won for best German dark lager, but you wouldn't have won for Schwartz beer because it's too roasty. So keeping people like Stan and my partner, Ryan Skinner, around me keeps me like in check, So yeah,
it was funny. Yeah, it was funny when Stan was here and with Kate Bernard, we were doing our best in beer tasting last year. I mentioned to him that Alex had that beer from you on his critics list, and Stan's like, that's not the best lager that Todd makes, but that's okay,
I love it. He's always that way.
Stan's honest shade is the best thing in the world. I absolutely love it.
Yeah. So when we submitted beers for GABF, I had Stan come up and kind of taste through everything. And yeah, he's a no frills kind of no bullshit guy. And I respect that. Like, surrounding yourself with people who are just going to build you up is, maybe good for the ego, but it doesn't make you better. And again, that's not coming from somebody who's just like constantly knocking you down. I firmly believe surround yourself with great people. But critical with good intentions is my favorite kind of people for sure. But yeah, it's definitely helped me be better.
Yeah. Let's again talk. I'm curious about some of those things. How have some of that feedback impacted? I want to, again, dive down into the things, because making small beers in particular is hard. It's harder than making a big, flavorful, higher ABV beer. There's less places to hide. The balance has to be much tighter. That there's the precision that's required to make that beer well and make that beer compelling, even despite the size. Talk to me about some of those ways in which you really do focus on elevating and making a beer that's that small stand out and be something that people want to keep drinking rather than just being the thing that fits the bill for them.
Yeah. It's about restraint, honestly. Like, I'm not trying to blow your hair back with, some shiny thing. I'm trying to think about what is going to make this the best instead of, just being this complex, like garbage thing. And it comes down to like monitoring your pH, making sure that, you're not over sparging to get, too much astringency for your mouthfeel, because astringency in small beer is huge. We made a beer called Lunar Gravity with Stan, and we actually stopped collecting on the second runnings because it had gotten so low in sugar. So we're like, all right, we're going to call it there. And, doing small beers actually is what kind of propelled me into almost doing decoctions on all of these, because, you don't have to, you get a little more sugar with the decoctions. And so I feel like just being careful, honestly, and not throwing something out of balance, and every single thing, whether it's, choosing the right yeast, the healthy yeast, or, fermentation, or all those things, it all goes into play. Like I was saying before, mentioning the other show, it's checking all the boxes for that beer. And we try to do that care with all of them. And I think about this a lot. Like whenever I'm creating an English beer, I think about what's going into the grist and the hops. And then the brew day is like kind of simple. It's a single infusion step or whatever. And then, you knock out at 64 degrees and you keep it between 64 and like 66, 68 tops. Whereas with a lager, usually, especially if it's a pale lager, very simple grist typically. Brew day is crazy. You're doing multiple mashes, and we now do 2 decoctions, which is a real pain in the ass. Like a single decoction is one thing, but we only have 3 vessels. And so we have to pull it out by hand. So we drop from the mash tun into Home Depot buckets. Like we have like 8 of these on the floor, and then a 32-gallon trash can that we use just for this. And, it adds about 2+ hours to the day, and it's messy. It's not pretty. And, I never think about brewing as like this elegant, beautiful thing. Like maybe if I'm thinking about somebody like, John at Cantillon, I'm like, he's like pulling a barrel sample and it's like this whimsical sort of thing. And I'm sure it's not, but I feel like I'm wrestling the grain and fighting to make this thing. It's like, it's a blue collar. I'm fucking Bruce Springsteen, on this, and I'm not like some Pavarotti or some shit. So I wrestle it into where it needs to go. But anyway, it definitely gets easier to do the moves as I've learned more. But it's exciting, at brew day, and especially when we're doing lagers, especially when we're doing these, multi-step mashes and decoctions. I love it. I have an assistant brewer now and does a lot of cellar work. His name's Clay. He's amazing, but you can tell that I'm excited. The old man is like up on the spree stand and he's just having fun wrestling this shit around, but I enjoy it.
Let's talk a little bit about ingredients. Obviously, decoction, building, especially in a small beer, building more body, more flavor out of simple ingredients, is a great trick in order to make more from something small. But good quality ingredients and selecting ingredients and being able to find flavors and then bring those flavors out of these kinds of ingredients is also a pretty important piece of it, given the scale of these beers. Talk to me about your process in evaluating ingredients, hops, malt, making yeast choices for how you ferment. And actually, let's talk about yeast later, because the fermentation is another big piece of all of this. Let's just talk about hops and malt for the time being, and again, how you taste through these things and make some of those creative decisions.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like for English beer, my favorite English malts are from Thomas Fawcett for base malt, and I'm a huge fan of Brees, and so I use their specialty malts for for a lot of our beers. The only other malt outside of Thomas Fawcett and Brees that I use is for our porter, and that is I use Crisp Chevalier, which is a grain I mentioned earlier, and I love it. And Crisp brown malt, which is pretty traditional for porters.
Yep.
When it comes to lagers, I'm a Weirmann person, like for sure. They're my favorite malt. On our little system, I get between like 90 and 92% efficiency, like on the regular. So if I'm brewing a pale lager, I'm like, all right, we gotta, maybe dial it down. Or I think all the brewers like whole bags, so we're not having some partial bags sitting in the grain room or whatever. But I'm always like careful when we're building like a little pale lager. But I love Weirmann. I actually just used Epiphany malt for the first time, and I like that a lot. we did a collab with our friends in Virginia. They're called Wheatland Spring.
Yep.
And we made a Czech-style Plato beer, and it was their modern pills and their chit malt. We did a double decoction on that. It was a 10.2 Plato starting gravity beer, and it's finished around 10:10. It's a nice little 4% beer. It's got a little haze to it now. We put the spunding valve on. We put it on a little bit late. I'll be honest with you, I had COVID at the house, and I'm calling Clay. I'm like, he'd never put a spunding valve on before. It's simple, but I just want to make sure that he had it, because we take them apart and all that kind of shit. But anyway, we put it on a little late, so it only got a tiny bit of carbonation. We're going to move that beer over a little later today and start, hopefully having it clear up a lot better. But anyway, so I like Epiphany a lot, but man, Weirmann all day long. I'm a huge Weirmann person. As far as hops go, for English beer, I mean, you can't really go wrong with Goldings and Fuggles, and those are what are in my my English beers. We just recently made an English summer ale, and I'll send you some of that. It's called Holographic Heart. It's a 4.2% beer, and it's all EKG. I kind of used a lot of it, even though it's all boiled hops. But I think we used in a 10-barrel batch around maybe 11 pounds, which is way more than I normally would. It's only got about 30 BUs, but man, it is really nice. Funny thing is, when we first brewed that beer, I'd been harvesting yeast, and I pulled it, and this was a fourth turn on this British yeast, and the first iteration dropped down to 2.1 Plato, so it was kind of dry. It was almost like a quasi-fruity lager, honestly, because we ferment it pretty cold. But it was good, but I felt like it didn't quite have that balance, and I'm like, all right, we're going to use a fresh pitch on this, and it's going to attenuate a little less. And so, the second batch is finished at 2.6 Plato, and it's lights out. It's really, really nice. But this round was all EKG. But, and then for lager beer, we do a handful of dry hops on lagers. We do one, it's called Any Day Now. And that's one we've done for a while with Blackberry Farm. That's done with a middle frost hop from Sites Family Farm.
Oh, from Sites. Okay.
Yeah. We go in on a big buy every year. We should be getting them hopefully the next 4 weeks or so. But with Halfway Crooks and Resident Culture and a couple other breweries. But that's one of my favorite hops. And one of my favorite places to get hops. We get Hersbrucker and a handful of other things from them. I am all about earthy, herbal hops. I feel like a lot of bigger breweries will do New Zealand or an Australian dry hop, and I think what it is sometimes they fear that maybe their folks who are drinking their hazy beer may not, they may have to see it with this kind of hop to get accustomed to it. But I don't know. I feel like those hops they kind of throw the beer out of balance in my experience from trying them. I haven't done one of those yet. I'm not saying it's not possible. But yeah, I prefer to keep it, noble or even an American hop like Sterling, which is one of my favorites. It's actually what's in our house lager, Die. But yeah. And then for, we make hazy beer, of course, too. And we do, the typical New Zealand and Australian dry hops and all that. I'm actually trying to get away from these crazy amounts of 4+ pounds of dry hopping. I want to dial it back down because, I've seen some oxidation on some of our beers. There's just too much hops in there. Not to mention the super low yield that you're getting from this stuff. And it's it goes back to what I was saying before. I want to make beer that I want to drink. And I want to make sure that even if I'm not reaching for our hazy beer, that it's what I find to be very drinkable. So,
yeah, sometimes we hear that statement a lot. Sometimes it's a cop out, and I shouldn't say. I mean, I think everyone has good intentions when they say that. Sometimes what you want to drink isn't what people want to buy, and somehow figuring out how to make a beer that is both what you want to drink and is also compelling to people, and figuring out how to make that compelling, to a consumer, that's a particular challenge. Obviously, maybe your standard for what you want to drink is just high enough and characterful enough that you keep pushing yourself to get to that point rather than just making a good beer, trying to make it a great beer. You've also found a way to tell an interesting story about these small beers by doing collaborations with other like-minded brewers, which is both a part of a learning process and a marketing approach, and this kind of connective tissue, brewer to brewer, that's helped to build relationships for you. It's interesting to see it working on multiple planes like that, but also keeping it interesting because here's another small beer, but it's a collaboration and it's going to be here and then it's going to go, and then it's on and on. So fascinating to watch that process be applied to these kinds of smaller beers. It's not just collaborative hazies or imperial stouts or whatnot. Nonetheless, let's talk about fermentation, because that's something that we haven't talked about yet here. Yeast is super important, especially in these small beers. Let's talk about ale yeast first, and then we can talk a little bit about lager fermentation, doing it on this small scale and still getting great results. What does your, kind of English and ale fermentation program look like?
Yeah. So and actually I'm going to answer or talk about something that you kind of touched on and then answer that question. That's okay.
Sure.
So we did a beer with Wooden Robot and De La Seine, and it was an English style beer. It was a dry hop ESB. And so we're like talking through recipe via email. Obviously, Yvonne is not in this country. And so we're chatting about that. And we're all pretty much on the same page with the grist of the recipe and all that. And I'm like, well, let's use ESB yeast instead of my house London yeast. And they were like, and one of them pushed like, no, just use the house stuff. It's fine. You're going to be like pulling it for the third time and it should be nice and robust, yada, yada, yada. But I was a little on the fence about it. And anyway, so brewed that beer and, it didn't quite attenuate as far as I thought it was going to. And actually the beer was, I forget what the finishing gravity was, but it was at like 3.8% ABV. We were shooting for like 4.2, right? Not a huge difference, but the beer had, and it was, like I said, an English style bitter, and it had a little too much sweetness. And I hadn't yet dry hopped it. This was around like maybe 2 days before Little Beer last year. And Dan from Wooden Robot was here, and we tried the beer together. And he's like, yeah, I see what you mean. It's good, but it's like definitely a little on the sweet side. I was like, yeah, I think what I'm going to do is drop the hops in there and rouse the yeast and see if I can get a little more action out of this. Well, I did. I'd already ordered the fucking labels. So the 3.8% ABV labels, they're headed my way. So I roused the yeast, and then over like 3 days, it took off, and it ended up being like 4.5%. And so I'm like, fuck. And, the beer was still fine. The only thing is like now it was like too thin. It was like, damn, it wasn't a huge dry hop. It was like 11-pound bag into 20 barrel tank of Brambling Cross. But it was just like out of balance. I was like, fuck. And I was so embarrassed because, it was a collab with De La Seine and Wooden Robot. And so we still canned it up and we put it on draft, and it was good. It just was not great. And so like, it's one of those things like collaborations are, they're great and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, you got to trust your gut. And I knew I should use ESB yeast. And the next time I brew that beer, I already told those guys that I'm definitely using ESB yeast. But yeah, it's funny because now instead of doing like, hey, let's do a fruity sour or big stout or a hazy IPA, which of course we do, people are reaching out about doing lagers and English beer, which is awesome. I love seeing that kind of trend. What was the original question?
And you can make it cool. You actually did talk about, we're talking about fermentation.
Fermentation.
Kind of ale fermentation approach. And then we can talk a little bit about lager fermentation.
Yeah. Oh, so, with our house lagers, I try to reuse our yeast as much as I possibly can. And what I like to, the yeast that I found to be the most neutral and most robust lager strain is Iyengar's Bach yeast. I use it for, 60-70% of our lagers in house. And I ferment that at 52 degrees. What I like to do is I'll knock out around 52 to 55 degrees and then just move it to 52. If it's at 55, I'll move it to 52 the following day. So I don't get super cold. Every now and then I'll ferment around 50, but typically I'm right at like 51 to 52 and a half degrees and try to knock out, like I said, 52 to 55. And after the first, 24 hours, if it was at 55, I'll knock it down lower. I was recently talking to a brewery and they were asking some advice about like lagers. They'd been doing it for a while. They're like, yeah, we knock out at 65. And then 3 days later, we move it down to 50s, I'm like, what the fuck? I was like, that is not the way. Your beer is basically done at that point. But, it comes from experience, and not to poke fun at people. But like I said, I was reaching out to a lot of folks about that same shit. But I do like to use different lager strains. Like right now we have, I think, 8 lagers on, and, three or four of those have Bach yeast. And then I've also got, 3470, which everyone loves. I find that used to be kind of expressive. It has like a fingerprint,
Sure.
You can taste 3470, and I like it, but it's not, that's why I like Bach yeast, because I'd rather taste what's going on with the character of the beer as a whole. But anyway, 3470, and we also just use a Southern Bavarian lager strain. So I like to pull in different yeast strains. What I'll do is, we have a bunch of yeast springs. Is I'll build like a 1-barrel starter and split it into a couple of these, and then, grow it up over 2 days and then go in. But also with fermentation with lager beers, we like to put on the spunding valve. Like I said, usually a couple, like a Plato and a half to 2 Plato above where terminal is. So I don't want to put it on or tighten it too much and stress the yeast out too early. So sometimes I'll miss my little window. And if I do miss the window, I'll then just Croix in the beer, because we like having some natural carbonation, whether it's from a spunding valve or Croixing process. But yeah.
That makes sense. It'd be challenging, though, using multiple lager strains like that, especially with a small brewery trying to brew these things. I mean, figuring out how each of those yeasts works to, optimally, is always that kind of challenge. So you have to, go back to some core of yeast that you're more familiar with, right?
Well, that's why I use Bach yeast for the most part, because I know what to expect out of that. And I think 3470 too. I mean, I always keep, dry bricks around in case we're in a pinch or whatever. But there have been a handful of yeasts that I've used and I've not loved. Like, we just used a Southern Bavarian strain I mentioned earlier. And, it has, like, in the aroma, a tiny bit of like bubble gum. And like I said, we fermented around, 51 degrees or so. And, flavor wise, it's great, but the aroma, I'm not in love with it. And then we used, I think it was S189, and man, I did not love that yeast at all. And I'll probably not use that again. So yeah, it's a little bit of trial and error for sure. But I mean, at the end of the day, we want everything to be very representative of, all the beers we put out. But sometimes if you're doing a one-off beer and you might not brew it again, you don't have a chance to like really nail it the next time. It's like some of these collabs, I want to rebrew them just to like really knock it out of the park. Because the first time I'm like, okay, it was good. It wasn't great. We got to get there. There was a lager beer that we made a few months back, and I feel that I can't wait to get back to. I'm like, I'll fucking kill it this next time.
It's the nature of lager brewing. The first one is never the perfect one. And, I mean, that's the case of most beers, that almost every beer improves the more times that you brew it. In terms of, so you're fermenting in cylinder conicals, I assume, not horizontal lagering takes. How do you get the right character, from these beers that you want, using that kind of, more conventional fermentation setup?
We lager for a long time. And so one thing that I like to do actually with most of our lagers is I'll go a little above the standard BUs for this type of beer, right? So I'm like, I want to go a little more bitter. And I know some people don't follow the logic of like bittering. They're just like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and they throw hops in. But I do still, I'll calculate it. And in Beersmith, actually, I still use it from my homebrew days. So I like to go a little more on that because, just in case we're going to lager a little longer and the hop character fades, I want to make sure that I've kind of hedged my bet a little bit. And so and it's not a lager, but our Kolsch, we ferment really cold too. But our Kolsch is on the more bitter side too, but I appreciate it. I like that in a beer. Like I said, I feel like it lasts a little bit longer. Same thing with our Marzen. It's a little more bitter. And I was trying a lager brewery recently. I was in Vermont, and they make world-class lagers, and I'm like, oh, they're kind of like, not that we're like as good as they are, but they're on the bitter side of lager brewing. But with the lagers, as far as fermentation and lagering, we lager for 6 to 8 weeks. We have bright tanks that we lager in. We're actually hopefully going to do an expansion in the next year or so, where we're planning on adding 3 more 20-barrel FVs back there and 4 20-barrel horizontals, which will help us, manage that production a little bit better. But yeah, as far as getting the right profile, again, to your point, it's like, using the appropriate yeast and trying to follow, style guidelines if that's your goal, and logging the beer until it's ready. We actually just made a beer with Ron Pattinson and Stan Hieronymus. This is 1939 Donker beer from Heineken that Ron found, and it's an interesting beer. Like, it has like a tiny bit of like Carafa 3, and it called for caramel, and most modern caramel has like some animal fats in it, or butter or cream or whatever, and so like I'm not putting that in the beer. So I had my pastry chef make us this little caramel that we use for it. But it's funny, we were talking on the recipe, I was like, well, Stan, what do you want to do with the hops? And so Ron chimes in, he's like, well, if we could just leave the beer as it is, I want to taste it as close to this as possible. But I followed his little recipe as best I could. It was like literally home brewing with a lot of pressure. It's like, all right, I'm going to nail this for Mr. Pattinson. But anyway, we're doing a release for that beer. He's going to do a talk on historic British styles while they're here when we release the beer. But it'll have lager for 12 weeks when he gets here, and it's tasting pretty good for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about ale fermentation. You mentioned that, especially on the English side, how does that side of fermentation on these small beers differ from your lager fermentation? Obviously, it's different, but are there yeasts that you find you're drawn to that you use, commonly, and are there some tips or tricks you use to get some better expression out of those?
Yeah, for sure. For all of our beers, we try to be on the cooler side for sure. And for those, our core English beers, we're knocking out usually around like 62, and we'll set the jacket to like 63 and a half, 64. And we keep it there for 2 or 3 days. And then we'll move it up just really slowly over. I'll usually try to chase it a little bit, like, degree and a half over like, 3 or 4 days. Those beers are usually pretty much done, in like 5 days or so. And the reason we don't spun those beers is because we have a huge cask program between here and Brick Store. So we have in our possession, I think, 30 pins and like 8 firkins. So, you can't like spun the beer and then fill these firkins. So we're filling those a lot, and which is great. I love that people are catching on with cask beer, and it's becoming popular. But yeah, that's a big part of what we do. It's filling firkins. But yeah, as far as that go, I think that some people trust their English yeast maybe a little too much. I just say like run VDKs and make sure you have a really good taster. To make sure there's no diacetyl in there.
For a long time in your history, you've just been selling beer over the bar. Obviously, the pandemic hit. You guys had to move a lot more into cans. How did that kind of shift, knowing that more and more of your beer is going to be consumed via package? Like, did that impact the way that you designed beers, or the way that you kind of pushed recipes in any kind of way?
Yeah, for sure. The pandemic was obviously crazy for the whole world. We first closed and turned it to a soup kitchen for like 2 or 3 weeks. And just because we didn't know what was going to happen, we had just changed our menu. So we had, all this new food, and we're like, we don't want this food to go to waste. And so me and my partner started making soups for people, and we're basically a soup kitchen for several weeks. Well, what's crazy though is like stopping the soup kitchen, because it wasn't like we're seeing hundreds and hundreds of people. We'd probably see, 30 to 50 people a day. We'd do it from, 10 until 5. But like seeing the people who were in need, it wasn't like it's all these people who just automatically became like hungry or, desolate or whatever. It was people who were within, 2-3 miles from us who were like already hungry. And I'm like, holy shit, how are we going to now stop doing this? Which is crazy. So anyway, with the question about the canning, we actually didn't have a canning line until well into the pandemic, and we have one of those little wild goose goslings. So it's like the single head can filler, and up until we got that, actually, I was just me in the brewery, and we had Clay, who I mentioned earlier, my assistant brewer, was hired as a host. He started serving and then bartending, and then I had to train him. I can't can this beer alone, but it's a very slow canner, so we can do like 10 to 12 cases an hour. But I'll be honest with you, canning and packaging in general is a pain in the ass. It's hard. It's a whole nother thing to know and learn. And before we had the canner, we were just doing the crowlers, and we would try to crowler up 10, 12 cases a day, right? So we went 10, 12 cases a day to like 10 cases an hour. So it was like a huge evolution as far as what we could package. So it was amazing. But, I remember putting beer into can. We're taking the CO2 reading on the ZOM, and then we're losing CO2 somehow. I'm like, I don't know how to fucking do this. This is, another new thing for me. Again, dipping my toe into the water, not knowing what it is. So I would say in the beginning, man, we probably put beer in cans that wasn't emblematic of what we have in the restaurant. And it's funny because it made me think of when I first started brewing, when our brewer left. I'm like, this is not emblematic of where we're going to be. But luckily, people were patient enough with us to kind of follow along with the ride to see where we're going. And I think we've gotten much better with canning. It's one of those things where I'm constantly having someone else, hey, can you come and take your Orbisphere and check the DOO on this can, this bright tank. Can you check these seams? Can you show me how to check seams? So it's been just a constant, learning on the fly. And it's been great, but it's definitely not been easy. But I feel like our practices from top to bottom have just gotten better and better. And I'm definitely proud of what me and my cohort back there are doing for sure. But yeah, we can a lot more beer. And I feel like, it's funny because, again, I told you earlier, we're outside the perimeter, right? So we're 45 minutes away from the city, right? So if you're just a beer traveler, you're to come out here is one thing, so being able to get a can of our beer, it needs to be in the best shape and canned the best way possible, because it's going to be your only experience with us unless you're making the trek out here. And I feel like we finally got to that point over the last 6 or so months, maybe. But I feel like we're always like qualifying ourselves. Like, no, we make good beer. Like, look at this, what we did. Look at that, So we're always like, fighting that whole cool thing, I guess. We're not a super cool brewery, and we're in the burbs. So there's that.
It's the rise of the anti-cool. By not being cool, it's cool again.
Cool doesn't last.
It doesn't have to be the sleekest, sexiest, hottest new hazy IPA to be interesting to people these days, and it's nice to see that there's a market for that out there. As we zoom out, what's the big picture look like for Good Word? What do you hope to achieve with Good Word, and what does success look like for you?
I mean, I'm already pretty happy. I'll be honest with you. Like, I feel successful. With that being said, it's one of those things where I'm never quite satisfied with where we're at. That's not from like a financial standpoint, like from where I was at Brickstore and what I was making to here, big step down. And, at the end of the day, everyone wants to make money, but I'm probably one of the rare people that, I don't know, maybe that's not rare, but I'm not in it for the money. Like, I'm in it to make the best fucking beer I can make and, be around people that I admire and look up to has made me feel successful already. But yeah, I do hope that we can, get a small expansion going on back there, which would take us from 589 barrels in 2022 to, somewhere around 2,000 barrels over the next couple of years. And then have a bigger canning line, of course, to facilitate all that beer. But yeah, success for me doesn't turn Good Word into a beer place that's beers going all over the place. I just want to I want to keep doing what we're doing, So yeah, I feel great. Like you mentioned, we got a little beer coming up the second year, April 9th. And we've got so many. The first year was amazing, and the people who came were great. This year, the list is insane. Like, I'm just honored that most of these brewers are not only sending beer, but they're coming. So it's pretty incredible.
It's been over the last few years, it's been interesting and fun for me to watch you deliberately, intentionally build these connections and do it in a way that's a little different than the way that, some other breweries do it. Like I said before, there's that learning aspect to it where you're asking for help, but you're also offering a perspective too. But you just have doggedly made these connections, across the country, now even around the world. And by building those connections, but also building something cool around small beers, it's been impactful. And obviously our critics, the folks that are writing for us, are seeing it, and our judges see it in a blind way. And all that is really kind of fascinating. So congrats to you, Todd. It's been really cool to watch how that whole thing has built. And that sounds like a good place to wrap up. G&D chillers use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers. Brew dry lagers with Fermentis Soft Brew LD20, available from BSG. Trust the logistics pros of Old Orchard to get your ingredients on time. Get detailed insight into your fermentations with Brew Monitor risk-free. Put SS Brewtech's advances to work in your brew house. And forget measuring. Try easy-to-use PBW tablets from 5 Star Chemicals. If you enjoy this podcast each week, we would love your support. Go to beerandbrewing.com. Click on the subscribe button, support what we do, and check out great content from all of the fantastic brewers that we cover here on the podcast. You can read those reviews of those Good Word beers. You can watch classes with Ro from Blue Jacket, all of these other kinds of things that we pull out there through a whole bunch of different media channels for you. It's by pulling all of these things together, from podcast to magazine, video, and whatnot, that makes our little self-owned independent media business work. And we appreciate your support on that. Todd, if people want to learn more about Good Word, want to taste your beer, want to learn more about what you do or where you do it, where do they find you guys?
You'll probably have to come to the source here in Duluth, Georgia, or follow us at Good Word Brewing. Or find me at a some kind of festival. We do a lot of those. Cool.
Well, I appreciate you talking with me on the podcast. Stay healthy. Stay safe. We've seen COVID running through places like left and right. It's closing breweries down, not because for any other reason than staff are sick and you just don't have people to run it. I'm heading off to Belgium in about 10 days, and I am on crazy personal lockdown just to not get sick and be able to get on a plane and go over there. Excited to be able to go record a whole bunch of podcasts in Belgium, in a few weeks from now. So some fun stuff coming up in the future here on the podcast. Todd, thanks for joining me. It's been great to talk to you. And keep sending me that beer because I love drinking it. Cheers.
It's an honor. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.